just a problem we had with the laptop. And now, finally, without further ado, may I introduce our speaker today, Kate Garnon-Williams, with her talk entitled Dangerous Waters, a History of Piracy in the Mediterranean. Kate's career covers archaeology, history, ancient languages, and so much more that I can only describe her as a thoroughly modern Renaissance woman. Please welcome Kate Garnon-Williams.
Thank you, Vivian, for those kind words. Are we all right for sound? Who was it? Flanders and Swan said, are we all right for quantity? There's not much I can do about quality at this stage. Now, the story of piracy in the Mediterranean goes back into deep mythology. In fact, the first act of piracy we hear about in Greek myth was actually perpetrated by a god, the god Apollo, who was planning to stage a coup in order to take over the oracle at Delphi. And to do this, he hijacked a ship, a merchant ship, as it was leaving Crete. That's right. And having hijacked it, he had disguised himself as a dolphin, and he nosed the ship all the way to Delphi, and then made use of the crew to act as the priests of his shrine. The second act of piracy we hear about was, ironically, perpetrated not by a god, but against a god. And the god in this case was Dionysus, or Bacchus, as the Romans called him, the god of wine and the god of theatre. And incognito, he hired a ship to take him to the island of Naxos, where he knew there was a girl pining for her lover. The girl in question was Ariadne, and you will remember Theseus, the rat, had dumped her on his way back from having killed the Minotaur. And having had a night of passion, he sailed away and abandoned her. And Dionysus, as a pure act of mercy, decided she needed comfort. Well, the pirates, however, started to alter course, and they had in mind the selling of their incognito passenger on the slave market. And at that point, Dionysus turned the mast and the oars to snakes and caused vines to spring up all over the ship, as well as the sound of flutes. And the crew members, being unused to classical music, leapt overboard in a fit of madness and were turned into dolphins who were commandeered by the god to nose him to Naxos. Well, when we come to kind of semi-history, the story of Odysseus gives us the first instance of pure naked piracy. And we're told in the Odyssey, in fact, Odysseus boasts about it. The wind, bearing me from Troy, brought me to the land of the Cicones. There I sacked a city, slew the men, and taking away their wives and many possessions, we divided them equally among us, as though the last clause mitigated the rest. But it is worth noting that the concept of piracy in the Mediterranean always included coastal raids and kidnappings to be held for ransom. And one of the earliest victims of just such a kidnapping was the young Julius Caesar. His father, having decided to make of him a Rhodes scholar, sent him to that island in order to attend its famous school of oratory. But in transit, Julius Caesar was kidnapped and held to a ransom which he later described as insultingly small. He was only 16. And while the ransom was being gathered by his father, he and the captain became quite chummy, he later related. And when the captain asked him what he proposed to do once the ransom was paid and he'd been dropped off at Rhodes, he said that he would make it his business to hunt down the pirate and bring him to justice. And the pirate thought this a tremendous joke. But Julius wasn't joking. And sure enough, when the ransom was paid, with rather chilling single-mindedness, he hired a warship and set off in pursuit of his ex-captors. He ran them down pretty soon, and they were brought back to Rhodes, where, according to the rigors of Rhodian law, they were crucified. Even as a young man, I think he must have been rather frightening, Julius Caesar. The paradox is, though, that later in life, it wasn't he who set out to eliminate piracy. That honor went to his fellow triumvir, Pompey the Great, who in 67 BC was given what was called Magnum Imperium Infinitum, the power, basically, all-seeing, all-dancing power to rid the Mediterranean within the space of 3 years. In point of fact, he did it in 3 months. And how did he accomplish this miracle? The answer is with extreme ruthlessness, but also cleverly, because having rounded up the ringleaders and executed them, he made a point of sending their followers far inland and giving them land to farm, where they would be out of sight of the sea and out of temptation to resume their bad old habits. Well, so he hoped. But anyway, for the time being, the Mediterranean appeared to be free from pirates, and those vital corn ships from Egypt could once again sail freely and frequently to Ostia, the port of Rome, and put a stop to riots in the city. In point of fact, the pirates were able to come back in spite of what the young Octavian, the great nephew of Caesar, and later the Emperor Augustus, claimed in what purported to be his autobiography, his Res Gestae, in which he boasted that he had rid the Mediterranean of pirates completely. Well, this was something of a porky. He hadn't. And with the Western Roman Empire petering out in the face of barbarian raids in the 5th century AD, the pirates were soon back in business, quite uninhibited, in the Western Mediterranean, where the writ of the emperor in Constantinople did not run. The pirates, having had to retreat from the Mediterranean, holed up in Cilicia, and were actually made use of, ironically, by the son of Pompey the Great when he was fighting the Emperor Augustus. And with their help, he was able to put a stop to the transport of corn to Rome. And this, of course, led to riots in the city and gross disorder. But as I say, the pirates were not actually into the business of marketing grain. Their prime business was dealing in slaves. And we're told by the historian, the geographer Strabo, writing a century later than Augustus, that the export of slaves greatly encouraged the pirates in their evil ways. Slaves could easily be obtained, and not far away was the island of Delos. And what was so special about the island of Delos? Well, you can see from the map, its location was everything. It was completely central in the Mediterranean or the Aegean, and despite its tiny size, it was the hub of trade. And we're told, also by Strabo, that hundreds of slaves every day would come under the hammer at the slave market there in the foreground with the pillars on the island of Delos. And this, of course, was the way the island made money. But as I say, with the ending of the Western Roman Empire and the total inability of the Eastern Roman Emperor, based in Constantinople, to patrol the West, the pirates were once again free from emperors and dictators trying to suppress them. And essentially, for the next 1,000 years, they were able to ply their trade, sallying forth from coves and well-defended bays along the coast of North Africa, from Morocco to Libya, unimpeded and completely successfully, terrorizing all sorts of shipping that went past. And it wasn't until the 15th century that two seminal events took place that were to alter the nature of piracy in the Mediterranean forever. The first of these happened in the year 1453, when Constantinople, the city that's now Istanbul, fell to the Ottoman Turks, led by a young man, Mehmet II, who clearly was disturbed by the smell of the slaughter that took place in the city. And Mehmet made it his business to build up his navy so that he could control the eastern Mediterranean. But this didn't affect what the pirates were up to in the western Mediterranean. And they were known as the Barbary pirates, which to them at this stage was a badge of pride. But originally they had been called by Greek colonists traveling along the north coast Barbaroi, people, not an insult, just an observation, people who were unable to speak Greek and made a noise that sounded to the Greek ear like bar bar bar. And this had originally, as I said, merely been a comment. It became an insult, but by the 15th century was something to be proud of. And the original people, the Greeks called the Barbaroi, came to be known as the Berbers. But of course, they were subsumed by the Arabs when the Arabs invaded all across North Africa and into Spain. And the two words Barbary and Berber became indistinguishable. Well, the Barbary pirates, as I say, continued unchecked and unchallenged, but they were affected, first of all, by the conquest of Constantinople, not immediately, but as the Ottoman emperors moved steadily westward, there were some pirates who saw in this not a threat, but a golden opportunity. More immediately, what affected the nature of piracy was the rise in Spain of Ferdinand of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon, who, when they married, united Spain effectively, and Isabella in particular had it in for anyone who would not convert to Christianity. And in her enthusiasm, she caused many Jews and Muslims to have to leave Spain. And we have arriving in North Africa, as you can imagine, many dispossessed Muslims, anxious for revenge. And it's not as though that was the extent of their woes, because Ferdinand and Isabella were anxious to set up observation posts on the coast of North Africa with the hopes of subduing any return of the Arabs to their country. And to this day there are two enclaves on the coast of North Africa, Ceuta and Melilla, which are still Spanish. And yet, to wander into politics, the Spanish complain about Gibraltar. However, into this, if you like, maelstrom of discontent and agitation appeared at the beginning of the 16th century, in 1504, two brothers, the elder Arouj and his younger brother Kisra. And they were interesting. They were the sons of a Christian mother and of a janissary. And who were the janissaries? They were almost all in origin Christian, young Christian boys kidnapped by the Sultan's chief of police, if you like, forcibly converted to Islam, and then trained as soldiers to become the personal bodyguard of the Sultan. And this was done with a purpose, because it meant they owed no loyalty to anyone else except the Sultan, and could not be corrupted in order to murder him or whatever. But in spite of their Christian mother, Arouj in particular had no reason to love her, because as a young man he'd been captured by the Knights of Rhodes, who'd started as the Knights Hospitaller in Jerusalem, or the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, an order that still exists, unlike the Templars. And the Hospitallers, having been driven out of the Holy Land, had built themselves a mighty fortress on the island of Rhodes. And they patrolled the seas very effectively. And having captured Arouj, he was held to ransom, and as it took a year for his father to raise the money, he was put to work as a galley slave. Forgive the anachronism. And this was a miserable life. We have an account by another galley slave of precisely what happened. They chained us 6 to a bench, 4 feet wide, covered with sacking, stuffed with wool. Sometimes the slaves rowed for 10, 12, or even 20 hours at a stretch, without rest. And the officers went round, putting pieces of bread soaked in wine into their mouths to prevent them from fainting. We also know that the stench from a galley could be picked up from a distance of 2 miles. Having done his time as a galley slave, Arouj neither forgave nor forgot, particularly the Knights of Rhodes. And it must have given him enormous pleasure when he arrived in Tunis in 1504 to be able with his fast ships called galleots, which had perhaps 9 pairs of oarsmen as well as sails, to be able to capture 2 ships that were carrying goods for the Pope that he had bought in Genoa. And he, Arouge and his brother, were able to capture these 2 huge galleons. And they did it cleverly. Arouge, using a special boarding bridge, was able to capture one of the galleons, and he immediately ordered all the officers to strip off their armour, and putting the armour on his own men, he put his own galliot in tow and turned the galleon about to go and meet up with the other galleon. And of course the captain of that second galleon, suspecting nothing, welcomed Arouge on board, only to be caught out. And he had to surrender his sword and the ship. And it must have given Arouge particular pleasure to have released all the galley slaves, Muslims, and replaced them with Christians for the long haul back to Tunis. And among the booty that he picked up were a number of Genoese noblewomen, who had come accompanying their husbands, but who were to end up, though they didn't yet know it, in the harem of the Sultan, since Arouge, being a shrewd operator, deemed it wise to keep the Sultan's suite with the odd gift. So the brothers prospered mightily, and the elder Arouge was given the nickname Barbarossa, Redbeard, clearly a strong family gene. And he was able to become extremely rich, preying on passing shipping. But he began to fret, stuck as he was in Tunis, where he was under the eye and the observation of the Bey, the ruler of Tunis, and having dislodged a Spanish garrison established on the island of Jerba, you can see that down at the bottom of the east coast of Tunis, he transferred his headquarters from Tunis to Jerba, and could now act without being under surveillance from the Bey, to whom hitherto he had had to pay a kind of tax in the form of a percentage of all his gains. However, he soon realized that though he was out of the sight of the Bey, he was also out of the sight of the main shipping lines. And it was borne in on him that he could do really with establishing himself back on the Mediterranean shore. And the chance presented itself soon afterwards. Please forgive this anachronistic map, but it does show clearly the position of a place called Bougie in relation to Tunis, and also Jerba down at the bottom of that gulf. And Arouge and his brother were invited by the exiled ruler of Bougie to help him dislodge the Spanish who had taken over the town of Bougie. And setting out with their galleots, their light but very fast ships, proved in the end to be a handicap, because they were not able to take with them cannon of sufficient power to blast a hole of sufficient size in the walls of Bougie. And when they made for the very narrow aperture they managed to make in the walls, Arouge was unlucky enough to be hit by a bullet from an arquebus, one of those early prototype rifles that were generally 100% inaccurate, but which in this case tore off Arouge's arm up to the elbow. Well, his younger brother Kisra took immediate command and ordered all their galleots to head back to Tunis as fast as possible, so that his brother could be attended by a good Arab doctor. And he himself, Kisra, set out much more rapidly than the rest. But the rest benefited from their slower journey by being able to attack a Genoese vessel that was moored off Tunis. And the quantity of gold and jewellery they were able to take from the ship must have done much to heal Arouge's arm. But you didn't attack a Genoese ship with impunity in the 16th century. And very shortly the Genoese sent 12 galleons led by their admiral, their very famous admiral, Andrea Doria, to punish the pirates. And he set out and managed to catch Kisra unaware of Jerba. And Kisra had to scuttle 6 of his galleots and beach the rest before escaping over the hills. But Doria, who then sailed home in triumph, should have been a little more thorough in eliminating the pirates, because no sooner had he disappeared over the horizon than Kisra was raising his sunken galleots and commissioning 3 more. And within a space of 3 years, he and his brother were back in business. Arouge sporting a prosthetic silver forearm. And the brothers then had the chance they'd been looking for. The Bey of Algiers himself, Selim II, he was called, asked for their help in dislodging a Spanish garrison that had established itself on an island at the mouth of the harbour in Algiers. And the brothers set out with only a few of their galleots for what proved to be a discussion. And this took place in the hammam, or Turkish baths. The precise details of what happened were unclear, but the upshot was that Selim did not re-emerge, having been strangled with a wet turban. And Arouge did, and he called himself not only the Bey of Algiers, but he was lucky enough to rule unchallenged for the rest of his short life, which could have been longer if only he hadn't become too ambitious and set his eyes on furthering his dominions, if you like, into Morocco. And there he was killed in a skirmish with a Spanish detachment. Well, with his brother dead, the hour of Kisra had arrived, and he would prove to be a much wiser man than his brother. And immediately he assumed both his brother's official title as the Bey of Algiers, and also took on his name, Barbarossa, since family likenesses being what they are, he too sported a red beard. Note, though, that the ships in this particular picture, the ships he is commanding, all have the half moon, the crescent and star of Turkey. How did this come about? Well, the final accolade that Kisra received was an invitation to come to Istanbul from the Sultan, who was perhaps, Suleiman the Magnificent was perhaps the wisest man and the shrewdest judge of character who ever sat on the Ottoman throne. And he was summoning Kisra not for a wigging, but to be appointed his High Admiral. Cleverly, he recognized a good sailor when he saw one. And the indirect result, of course, for this was that every single pirate along the Barbary coast was now unofficially under the protection of Turkey and at least recognized as a unit in the Turkish Navy. This brought a status that was worth an enormous amount. Well, Kisra was summoned and proved to be superb. Within a year, he'd commissioned 60 galleys. And with these, he would also set about making of the Turkish Navy an effective fighting weapon. And for those two powers, Genoa and Venice, who had been trading up till then freely in the eastern Mediterranean, the writing was well and truly on the wall. And very soon, once those galleons were built, battle was engaged. And although Kisra was vastly outnumbered, off the coast, the west coast of Greece, at a place called Prevesa, he was able to completely rout the combined Christian navies of Naples, Rome, Genoa, and Venice. And so numerous were the sailors and crew that were beached on the shores of Greece that it said you could buy a Christian slave for the price of an onion. Kisra had one lost commission to carry out for Suleiman the Magnificent. Suleiman had formed an unlikely alliance with the French against the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who was in fact the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. And in order to further this alliance, Kisra set out from Istanbul and slowly made his way westwards. But as he went through the Straits of Messina, his old piratical habits reasserted themselves, and he couldn't resist conducting raids all along the coast, starting with the mainland town of Reggio de Calabria. And having sacked that, he acquired an 18-year-old girl, the governor's daughter, whom he took as one of his wives. When having made it eventually to Toulon to join up with the French Navy, they wintered there, the French studiously ignoring the fact that all the Turkish galleons were manned by Christian slaves. But inevitably, that alliance was short-lived, and Kisra soon found himself sailing back to Istanbul, not again above a little piracy along the way, although apparently he did desist from sacking Reggio a second time, possibly out of deference to the 18-year-old girl he'd married, with whom he seems to have fallen passionately in love. And having arrived back in Istanbul, he went into honourable retirement in a castle given to him overlooking the Bosphorus, and doubtless spent his declining years in connubial bliss. Well, he was succeeded as High Admiral by a very interesting man who came to be known as the Master of the Mediterranean, and not so much for his prowess as a fighter as his mastery of all things, all skills nautical. He was born in the town of Bodrum, what used to be Halicarnassus on the west coast of Turkey. And as a 12-year-old, he attracted the attention of the governor thanks to his skill in throwing a spear and in using bows and arrows. And under the patronage of this Turkish governor, he was sent to Istanbul to a school, a military school, where he mastered the arts of navigation and, as I say, all things military. Well, he had been the chief lieutenant of Kisra, but now he took over as High Admiral for Suleiman. And he and Suleiman both saw that if they wanted to expand the Turkish navy ever westward, which was indeed their ambition, eventually to completely control the Mediterranean and then to start moving inland into northern Europe, the one thing, their priority had to be to get rid of the old Knights of Rhodes, who, having been expelled by Suleiman himself in 1522, have now resettled themselves on the island of Malta and have become the Knights of Malta. And as such, they were every bit as ruthless and predatory as the Turks, only they, of course, did it in the name of Christianity. Well, Dragut was able to achieve a famous victory off the island of Jerba, which had once, you remember, been the property of Arouge when he'd expelled the Spanish garrison. And in a tremendous battle against overwhelming odds, Dragut was able to achieve a great victory, in the course of which he annihilated no fewer than 27 ships belonging to the Knights of Malta, because they had been at the forefront of the action, as they always were. And as they limped back to Malta, they were aware that they were the last bastion to stop the Turkish control of the entire Mediterranean. And the Knights were lucky at this point in having as their Grand Master a man in his 60s, a Frenchman, Jean de la Valette. And as we know, against all the odds, he was able to hold out against the siege of the Turks that began in 1565. He was fortunate in that Dragut, whom he'd met in the past, they were old sparring partners, because originally, 20 years, not long after the siege of Rhodes, the Grand Master's ship had been wrecked, and he'd found himself a galley slave on Dragut's ship, waiting to be ransomed, which took a year. And ironically, their roles were reversed only a few years later, when this time Dragut was captured and put to work as a galley slave until he could be ransomed. And it's said that Jean de la Valette could not resist calling down to Dragut, "Bad luck, old chap, just not your lucky day," or the equivalent, to which Dragut is said to have replied, doubtless through gritted teeth, "Just not my lucky day, I guess." this time. And sure enough, as we've seen, he had his revenge at the Battle of Jerba. But in Malta, he met his nemesis, and as we know, the siege had to be called off, and La Valette held out against them. Dragut actually died during the siege. He arrived late, 2 weeks late after it had begun, and then very shortly afterwards he was struck by a flying splinter of rock which killed him. But it's fitting somehow that while the town that used to be at St Elmo had to be rebuilt after the siege and was called Valletta in honour of de Valette, Dragut was not forgotten, since one of the points within the harbour you can see, Punta di Draguta, also remembers him as well. So the old sparring partners are hardly a stone's throw apart, even in death. Well, the siege of Malta did have the effect of galvanizing Europe into realizing what the Turks were up to. And their concerted action was clearly called for. And this took place in 1571, again off the west coast of Greece, at the famous Battle of Lepanto. And the Turkish navy, having been defeated, they had to retreat back to the east and no longer constituted a threat to Western Europe. But of course, the pirates were still happy chaps, now no longer owing allegiance to any effective powers, since the Turks were back on their side of the Mediterranean. And for the next 200 years, the pirates continued to menace shipping from any and every nationality that passed through the Straits of Gibraltar on their way east. And it's a strange thought, but at the beginning of at the end of the 18th century, with the dawning of the Age of Reason, it became apparent that most European countries thought it was time, really, the pirates were eliminated as a menace. But it was too easy to pass the buck and to pay your dues to the Bay of Algiers or wherever, just to make sure he didn't attack your shipping and instead went for somebody else. It's a kind of mafia arrangement, if you like. You paid your dues and you got off lightly. But strangely, it was the Americans who decided to fight. Up until the Declaration of Independence in 1775, they had benefited in their trade in the Mediterranean from the protection of the Royal Navy. But of course, with the coming of independence, they could no longer do that. And they were beginning to feel the extent of the financial loss to their trade in the Mediterranean. And in the year 1803, it was decided to send a squadron of ships under the Commodore Edward Preble in order to suppress the pirates once and for all. Well, they decided that they would besiege, if you like, the Bay of Tripoli, and seemed to be making good progress with their larger and more powerful ships. But Preble was unlucky because one of them, US Philadelphia, of which this is a faithful rebuild, ran aground when it was pursuing a pirate ship inland. And all 300 officers and crew were taken prisoner. And because the Bey had an inflated idea of American wealth, he demanded a ransom of no less than $3 million. Well, this was not to be borne. But worse was the disgrace of having a US ship in enemy hands. Preble was caught between a rock and a hard place, you might say. That ship had somehow to either be regained or blown up. It could not remain in enemy hands. And given its proximity to the guns of Tunis, the harbour in Algiers, clearly recapturing it was not an option. So he asked for volunteers, and a young lieutenant Stephen Decatur with 60 other volunteers disguised as pirates and in a pirate ship set off for the US Philadelphia. And they managed to get on board pretty well without resistance and to place charges throughout the ship before escaping, and it then exploded, and at least Preville's honour and that of America was saved. But Decatur was not satisfied with what he'd achieved, and in 1815 he came back, this time as the Commodore in charge of a large squadron, and this time he was going to pin the Bay of Tripoli down into surrendering all rights, in inverted commas, of piracy. And this was to be done not only by sea but by land. And the US consul in Tunis colluded with a force of Egyptian Arabs who owed no loyalty to the Bay of Algiers, and to the Bay of Tripoli, and force-marched them overland from Egypt, so that Tripoli was attacked by both land and sea, and with no place to hide or turn to, the Bay had to sign an agreement to give up piracy. But the presence of the American Marines at this particular incident explains why the first verse of the battle hymn of the US Marines to this day begins with the words, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we shall fight our country's battles in the air, on land and sea." And I have to say that the last time I gave this lecture, there was a group of 10 Americans who stood up and sang that. Do I have any volunteers? And then, so were the pirates down and out? Down, certainly, but not quite out. What would ring the knell for the pirates in the end was modern technology. Because with the coming of steamships in the 1840s that could both outrun and outgun the pirates, suddenly they were out of a job, and more particularly because steamships could round the Cape of Good Hope in all weathers in the vital trade with India and the Far East. And piracy, if you like, after a 3,000-year dishonourable history, ground to a halt for want of the technological know-how. And I think we can be grateful, perhaps, that today, when we travel in the Western Mediterranean, we don't have to take the precaution of bringing with us an onion to pay for our ransom. Thank you very much.
Can I make a point? I'm sure you know about this. Giles Morton's book, The White Slaves, talks about 1 million whites who were taken over years into slavery in North Africa. Oh, yeah. And the other point, am I right in remembering in West Loo, in Cornwall, is it? There's a plaque on a door which records the Barbary raid of whatever date it is. I think it's in the 1600s, wasn't it?
Oh, yes, you're right. First of all, we know for a fact that 74 children were taken from Gibraltar once the British had established themselves there, taken by the Barbary pirates. And that made considerable inroads on the population. And you're right, too, about the extent to which the pirates started raiding. They were certainly in England. They went to Ireland, to Baltimore, where they took an enormous number of slaves, which they brought back with them, and were then held to ransom. And there was a particular priest who worked hard to effect these ransoms and to make sure the children, who was usually children kidnapped, were well treated. Yes, you're right. They were extending their reach, if you like, further and further. And Newfoundland as well, they're said to have gone as far as Newfoundland. To whether there's a plaque there to prove it, I can't say.
Over in the top, please.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Well, Madam, I thoroughly enjoyed that. It brought to a fantastic conclusion some experience I've had, which I just want to put into the pot. I served on for 3 months on the tall ship Pelican, which had been designed by a chap who was following Barbary pirate technology, so that it could sail much closer to the wind. So when it raped and pillaged, it could escape without being followed. And so that really was the technical reason for their survival for so many years. And I think the fascinating point is that you highlighted that modern technology overtook the old technology, which is wonderful. I'm just also wondering, Madam Chairman, whether there's a space for a group that could help us study the art of piracy. I don't know.
We can study anything.
Well, I think the university is based in Somalia.
I just wanted to say, Kate, I also enjoyed it very much indeed, and I was going to mention, of course, a lot of the piracy has now moved round to the Somali area, but we have a slightly different problem now in the Mediterranean, those of migrants. And I don't know if you've had experience on your various trips you go on, has this been an issue in the boats you're in?
Yes, curiously, I've cruised about 6 times this year, and on each cruise, the captain on the first evening has said over them, face to face, I have to tell you that if we run into or come across any migrants, maritime law demands that we pick them up, and they will occupy the top deck, and I'm afraid it's short rations for everybody. So it is a problem that is perhaps returning, paradoxically. And I've been in a ship in the Red Sea that, not on my cruise, but on the one immediately afterwards, was chased by Somali pirates the length of the Red Sea. They managed to outrun them, though, at the end. And not, sadly, to outcome them.
Okay, well, Kate, what a tour de force that was. For me, I remember Pompey, the chap in the 1st century who managed to execute the pirate leaders but give lands to those who made to follow them. I thought that was a stroke of genius. It did assure the daily bread to the Romans, for a while anyway. Seriously, there's a running thread of religionism through there. Christians fleeing now from the Middle East, but in the past it was the Christians exiling the Muslims from Spain. What comes around goes around, I'm afraid. But Kate, your witty and amazingly humorous delivery of such a gruesome history will be very difficult to forget. Thank you.